Let me show you how exactly it happens. This image is very dark, but not because it's underexposed. You can see that the numbers here on the shoulder are pretty normal for human skin. And we're not talking about exposure anyway. Because of the contrasted light scheme which was used for this particular photo shoot, all the black clothes look very dark. This particular area on the back is about 11, 11, 11 in average. So, just for an experiment, let's say I need to make this area reach 20, 20, 20 without changing the rest of the image. How can I do that? In the modern Camera Raw process, there are two sliders responsible for the leftmost part of the histogram, the shadows and the blacks. If you use the shadow slider, you'll see that it affects the model too, not just the dress. So let's use the blacks instead. I'll set the eyedropper on the upper part of the back and increase the blacks value until I get 20 in at least one channel. Something between +35 and +40 is all it takes. I'll apply the changes and open the image in Photoshop. Now let's open the same image in Camera Raw again, set the blacks back to 0, go to the Calibration tab and change the process to 2010. The image gets darker immediately. That's because the old process adds some contrast by default. First thing you have to do when you switch to it, go to the Tone Curve tab, switch it to the Point Curve, and make sure it is set to Linear. The black slider is set to 5 by default, and it also increases contrast in the shadows. So if I want to see the original image, I have to change this value to something about 3. If you don't like this instant contrast increase, you can save the new Camera Raw defaults by going to the menu and clicking on the Save New Camera Raw Defaults command. As for the brightness and the contrast sliders, their initial values are +50 and +25, but they do not really change anything in the image. It's the same as 0 on the other sliders. I don't know why Adobe set them to something like that. Recovery, blacks and fill light are all set to 0, and you can't use any negative values there, while exposure, brightness and contrast can be shifted below 0. It might look like a weird set of sliders with weird values, but don't underestimate the old process. You'll get used to it if you use it long enough. Let's try to make the darkest areas of the dress lighter. In the older version, the fill light slider is responsible for that, not the blacks. The blacks can be used to increase contrast in the shadows, while the fill light does the opposite. As the old process treats the image in a different way, when I set the blacks to 3, the dress doesn't appear so dark in the first place. When I move the eyedropper tool around the shoulder, you can see it's almost 20 in average already. So I just have to move the fill light slider a little bit. And it's not +35, about +5 is enough. This is what I like about the old process, the numbers are not big. It's easier to twiddle with the sliders. There's more to it than just numbers. On the image with the dress, the difference between the old and the new process is not so evident. To see it, we have to alter the image more significantly than that. I'll use a JPEG this time. In the new process, it takes +80 in the blacks to make the surface reach 20 in average. When I switch to the old process, pay attention to the fact that the blacks is set to 0. It only changes to 5 when you deal with RAW images, and we have a JPEG. Contrast and brightness are 0 as well, which is not as confusing as with the RAW format. But anyway, let's move the fill light slider to the right. It only takes +20 to reach the same numbers as with +80 in blacks in the new version. When I compare both images, you can see that the sweater looks practically the same. But pay attention to the lips. The old version processing has more contrast than the new one. Not losing much contrast is a very good thing. That's not all. Back to the previous dress. It has some draping on the back, and it would be good if I could make it more visible. If I open the same image again, set the blacks to 5 and the fill light to 18, I can increase contrast in the shadows, revealing the draping. Be careful though, as the black slider can cause shadows clipping. Watch it so the histogram doesn't get cut from the left side. To achieve the same result in the new process, I would have had to move 3 sliders instead of 2, and the logic behind that is a bit obscure. Why increasing the exposure if the image didn't get much brighter in the end? What with the shadows and the highlight sliders? Let's do something with the white item, like these jeans here. You can hardly see anything here because the image is too bright in the highlights. We have to make the brightest areas darker so that the customers would be able to see the details. In the new process, I have to move the whites to -40 until the numbers under the right pocket reach 235. The brightest areas are not as bright as before compared with the original. Now you can see what's going on here. To achieve the same result in the old version, I'll set the recovery slider to 40, so see, this is the same as the white slider, just backwards. Compared with the previous image made in the new version, the jeans are standing out a bit more, but overall difference is not big. So, if you're used to the new version and if you know your way around all the sliders already, I don't think it's worth changing the process to the old 2010 version. You can keep using the new one. But if you have difficulties understanding what the new sliders do, you might find the old version better. I find it very logical and easy to use. Every slider is responsible for its respective part of the histogram. The names are confusing, but once you get it, you're cool. The exposure slider is not used to make images lighter, as it mostly affects the highlights located in the rightmost part of the histogram. Move the slider to the right, and the highlights in the histogram move to the right, becoming even brighter. The recovery slider does exactly the opposite. Use it to reduce glares and make white items more visible. Recovery and exposure together can be used to manipulate contrast in the highlights. Same with the blacks and fill light sliders. The fill light lowers contrast in the shadows, while the black slider does the opposite. For overall exposure, use the brightness slider. For overall contrast, use the contrast slider. Every slider is useful for typical catalog retouching issues. You don't have to move all the sliders for a few minutes to get a good result. The process is clear and easy to master. The new process, well, I can only say it's completely counterintuitive. Anything you want to do requires you to move sliders back and forth, try many sliders, and still they don't work as intended. I'll move the shadow slider to the far right. The background changes from 240 to 244, despite the fact that 240 is located in the rightmost part of the histogram. It's not shadows, it's highlights. If I move the blacks to the far right, the hands get brighter. Do they look like blacks to you? Blacks, whites, highlights, and shadows affect the whole histogram, so when you move one slider, you have to move others as well to undo the changes that didn't even have to take place. The same is true about the old process, but not to the extent when you can't do what you want to, and just sit there wondering why you have moved all the sliders and the image is still no good.